Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's March 27th, and you may already know that March is MS Awareness Month. Well, tomorrow we'll be observing the first ever Progressive MS Day, which is being celebrated by several MS advocacy groups and state governments across the United States. And I have two very special guests on this week's podcast to talk about Progressive MS Day. My guests are Dan and Jennifer Digmann. Jennifer was diagnosed with progressive MS in 1997, and Dan was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in 2000. Dan and Jennifer met at a National MS Society event in 2002, and they were married in 2005. Together, Dan and Jennifer write an MS blog, they host a podcast, they've written a book, and they've been inducted into the National MS Society's Hall of Fame for Advocacy. In a few moments, we'll talk with Dan and Jennifer Digmann and get their thoughts about Progressive MS Day and on what life is like when both partners in a marriage have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But first, there are a few other things that you should know about. Up to 80% of the people living with MS experience pain, and up to a third of them report that pain is either a significant or the most significant symptom of their disease. And because of its very nature, pain can interfere with any or all activities of daily living, including sleeping, working, socializing. I think it's safe to say that pain gets in the way and detracts from most anything that we might want to spend our time doing. So finding ways to manage pain, what experts refer to as pain interference, becomes an important part of trying to live your best life with MS. Now, a recent study indicates that people living with MS use an average of 9 different methods to manage their pain. And the most commonly used pain interference strategy is taking medication. And that can have its own ripple effect into your quality of life. But a recent study done at Oregon Health and Sciences University points to something that's quite different from taking medication as a means of pain interference. The study suggests that there is a clinically significant association between mindfulness and pain interference in MS. Now, mindfulness is described as the ability to be wholly present with one's experience. Jon Kabat-Zinn first studied the practice of mindfulness as a pain interference strategy in 1982, and he describes mindfulness as, and I'm quoting now, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And that's the end of the quote. Observing in a non-judgmental way is a key characteristic of mindfulness, and that includes observing your own experience of pain. Now, other studies have shown mindfulness to be effective as a pain interference strategy for people battling cancer, lower back pain, and arthritis, but there hadn't been a study looking at mindfulness as a strategy for mitigating MS-related pain until now. And the Oregon Health and Science University's study makes the case that people living with MS should give some serious consideration to practicing mindfulness to better manage their MS-related pain. You can find some excellent mindfulness resources, including a guided mindfulness meditation for coping with pain by Jon Kabat-Zinn himself at Amazon.com. And since pain management is something that I know several of you would like to hear more about, I'm going to try to bring someone onto the podcast as a future guest who can talk more about practicing mindfulness as a means of pain interference. So please stay tuned in the coming weeks for that. while we're talking about things that you can start doing today that may help manage your MS symptoms, you might want to consider the results of another recent study done at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. This study was actually a follow-on analysis of data collected in a previous study by the same researchers. Now, their previous study made the case that people living with MS who were ambulatory could gain a benefit in their cognitive processing speed by walking on a treadmill. And while the connection between exercise and cognitive ability among people living with MS isn't new, this follow-on study analyzed MRI images to show that exercise by walking on a treadmill impacted brain function. In other words, researchers could actually see the area of the brain that was being positively impacted by walking on a treadmill. So in this case, exercise, walking on a treadmill, was shown to alter the brain function in people with MS. So this is one prescription that you can write yourself and hopefully start benefiting from. Finally, there's one more MS symptom management strategy that can be categorized under, yes, you can try this at home. And that strategy is simply getting a good night's sleep. Now, quality sleep is important to everyone for maintaining good health, but for people living with MS, the stakes are raised significantly because a lack of restful sleep can impact your cognitive abilities, increase fatigue, cause mood swings, and physically impact your balance, your spasticity, and even your level of pain. And studies have shown that people living with MS can be up to 3 times more likely to experience sleep disturbances than the general population. So getting a good night's sleep isn't just the generic good advice your grandmother might have given you. It's an effective way to help minimize some of your MS-related symptoms. Now, some of the keys to getting a good night's sleep are things you've probably grown up hearing repeated over and over. So consider the next few seconds your refresher course in getting a good night's sleep. First, try to go to sleep and wake up at the same time every day. This kind of regularity can help set your biological clock. And remember to clear your mind before going to bed. If you have a lot on your mind, you might want to try writing it down, maybe creating a to-do list for the next day, so that you don't have to carry all of that mental clutter to bed with you. Remember that exercise is a stimulant, so don't exercise right before bed. Give your body a few hours after exercising to cycle down for the night. And while we're on the subject of stimulants, try to limit your caffeine intake to mornings only. Now, sometimes having a specific bedtime ritual helps cue your body that it's time to start slowing down. Maybe that means spending some time listening to relaxing music, or writing in a journal, or even reading before going to bed. And be sure you set the right scene. Make sure your bedroom is cool, quiet, and dark. And once you turn the lights out and go to bed, it's time to stop making notes about work. It's time to stop reading on your Kindle. It's time to stop checking your phone, and it's time to stop watching TV. And if you don't fall asleep within 15 or 20 minutes after turning out the lights, then get up and try a relaxing activity. Then it's lights out again and off to sleep. Also, keep in mind that sleep disturbances can be caused by stress or depression, and the disruption of important neurotransmitters like dopamine, norepinephrine, and melatonin can cause narcolepsy and fatigue throughout the day. Even the side effects of some MS medications can interfere with your sleep. So if you find that you're not getting the quality sleep that people with MS especially need, you might want to check in with your doctor to see if there are other steps that you can take to get your sleep pattern back on track. At the beginning of the podcast, I told you that tomorrow, March 28th, is the first, I guess you could call it the inaugural, Progressive MS Day. In a moment, we'll be joined by my guests, Dan and Jennifer Digmann, to talk about what Progressive MS Day means to them and to get a glimpse into what life is like when both partners in a marriage have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I'm thrilled to have Dan and Jennifer Digmann as my guests today on the podcast. Jennifer was diagnosed with progressive MS in 1997, and Dan was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in the year 2000. Jennifer and Dan met at a National MS Society event back in 2002, and they were married in 2005. And together, and by the way, I think together is really the operational word when it comes to these two. Together, they write an award-winning MS blog. They host the A Couple Takes on MS podcast on the MS&Me radio network. They've co-authored a book entitled Despite MS to Spite MS. And in 2015, they were inducted into the National MS Society Volunteer Hall of Fame for Advocacy. Full disclosure, after following their blog and their podcast, I met Dan and Jennifer a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C. at the National MS Society's Public Policy Conference and Day on Capitol Hill, and I immediately invited them to join me on the podcast. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Now, Wednesday, March 28th is the first ever Progressive MS Day, and it's being celebrated by several MS advocacy groups and state governments. So tell me, what is Progressive MS Day all about, and what makes it important to you?
For me, it's confirmation that those of us living with progressive multiple sclerosis have not been forgotten. And it's a day to recognize and just acknowledge the fact that progressive multiple sclerosis, they have treatment option available now, and that it's still a viable population that is important and matters in the community at large. Finally, it's about time because, I was diagnosed with MS actually over 20 years ago, and I watched a number of medications come on the market that were indicated for people with relapsing remitting MS. And I was, feeling a little like, what about me? What about me? And finally now there's a day to celebrate those of us living with a more progressive form of the disease. And there are treatment options available for progressive forms of MS.
Jennifer, I completely understand that what about me perspective. My wife was diagnosed with progressive MS the same year you were. And so we've been on the sideline watching and waiting as well. And absolutely, it's been a really good year for getting good news if you're living with progressive MS. We have the first approved treatment for it. There is some incredible research going on as we speak. And there's, I think, more of a focus on trying to figure out progressive MS than we've ever seen before.
Yes, I agree. And that's an exciting thing. It's an excellent time, if you can say that, living with multiple sclerosis. Dan chuckles.
It is. Well, and I think that's the reality. I've been living with the relapsing remitting MS, but then when you have your wife living with progressive MS, I think it's really easy to obviously focus on the newly diagnosed and everything, but then it's like I always feel like what about the seasoned veterans and those who have been living with it the longest? That really there still needs to be support and recognition for everyone living with the disease. So I think this is like Jennifer said, it's about time. This is great.
Absolutely. Now, I'll ask the obvious question, I think, since the name of your podcast is A Couple Takes on MS. I'm curious, do you think that MS is more challenging or less challenging to deal with when both partners have been diagnosed with it?
I think, and I don't want to make others out there jealous who don't have a spouse with multiple sclerosis, I think it's a little easier because if I tell Dan that I'm really tired and my fatigue level is high today, or that my numbness in my right hand is making me crazy, he can shake his head and say, I know what you're talking about, and vice versa. And so that innate understanding of the disease is really, I don't want to say it's a blessing, but it is, to say he understands.
And I think on every given day, obviously, there is that understanding, but it's just like then I can help Jennifer with like transfers and things. But if I get sick, that makes the days a lot lot more challenging. Just because I can't help. I know that we were in the hotel just last year, and I got sick, and I mean, we were basically could not make the trip that we had planned to do because I couldn't help her make transfers because I was so weak. And so, I mean, on those moments, it's just like what we wouldn't give to have an able-bodied spouse and those elements. But I think that's
a good point.
But for the most part, I think Jennifer gets it. And if I'm tired, I don't even need to explain. It's just like you just say, I'm tired. Whereas I think, we lead a self-help group, and just when we hear stories where others are saying that when they comment that they're tired, if they have an able-bodied spouse who doesn't have MS, maybe they don't fully understand what that means. And so, yeah, I think in that sense we're very fortunate.
Well, I know that you're both pretty serious music fans. I think I read that somewhere. And music can be motivating. It can be inspiring. Sometimes music can reflect our mood or our state of mind, and sometimes it can change our mood or change that state of mind. So I'm curious, have you found a way to make music a part of your battle with MS?
I think very much so. Both Dan and I have listened to music and picked up certain song lyrics and turned them into mantras in just an easy way to say, to help us in the battle with MS. And of course, what's great is it's available all the time. So it's a comfort or just something you can always use it, and then it's fun. And it's a good sense of community if you get to go to a concert. So I think music is really important. Wouldn't you agree, Dan?
Well, yeah, of course I do. I do. It's like, from day one after I was diagnosed with MS, I was like, even before MS, I mean, I was a kid of the 80s. So, of course, I fell in love with Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA. And then you just become a fanatic, a freak about Springsteen. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, I made a compilation CD for a religious sister because I had to convince her how Springsteen provided a religious experience. And there were like 8 songs that totally helped me overcome and deal with life with MS and get a vision for a brighter future. And so, I mean, Springsteen's always been my go-to. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Since you just mentioned finding ways to deal with a life with MS, I know the title of your book is Despite MS to Spite MS. How do you live each day despite MS, and what do you do to spite MS?
We went to an exercise class, and it was very much like, take that, MS. Look at me. I'm using my arms, and I'm getting a workout. And so I think that's one of the things that we both do is I try and say, I don't want to be cocky, but a little bit like, is that the best you got, MS? Look at me. I'm trying to spite you, and I'm living the best life as I possibly can. I'm not letting the disease hold me back. And yes, that can be challenging because the disease is a pretty strong monster, but I don't want to give it any more than it deserves to take from me.
And I think that's just, because Jennifer and I, when we met, we both had MS. And I mean, there's just a lot of questions you have as you're looking at, I really want to spend my life with this woman, but we both have MS. How is this going to work? And I think that really just, we got married despite the fact that we had MS. And so then I think everything we've done since then, every day is just so you do it to spite it. It's just like just even getting up in the morning, or like Jennifer said, going to the exercise classes, or, I mean, just doing things that we're not supposed to be able to do because of the disease. I think that's just to spite it every day.
I'm wondering if there is a particular moment, event, or experience that you might have had in the past together that you'd consider one of the most challenging aspects of your MS journey together, and maybe to counter that, to balance it out a little bit, if there's a moment or experience that's been one of the most rewarding aspects of your MS journey.
Well, John, I instantly think when Dan and I first were married, maybe 2 to 3 months, you're laughing, When we were first married, we'd been married maybe 2 or 3 months, and as he said, I need his help to transfer to use the restroom. And he was going to transfer me, and the transfer didn't go well, and I ended up in a pile on the floor. And of course, my emotions are, I'm newly married, and I'm crying, and I look up at my husband, and I say, it's not too late if we wanted to get an annulment, or if you wanted to get an annulment. I imagine we probably could. And, baby, I don't want you to have to deal with me and not being able to do things on my own. So I think that was one of the most challenging moments, and we reference back to that still to this day, 12 years into our marriage, because I think that was one of those. And Dan just looked at me. He put his hands on my face just so he could totally have my attention. He said, Jennifer, I took the vows. I'm in this for the long haul, and I hope you feel the same way. And there's never been talk of a divorce or annulment since. We're in this together for the long haul.
Do we have maybe a particularly rewarding moment or experience that comes to mind?
That's you, Dan. I got the easy one.
I think, as far as specific moments, I think that, boy, there's so many, but I think just anything we do, I think, the first time that we flew together with the wheelchair, making, there's so much that goes into traveling with the wheelchair, with the disability, making transfers and stuff. And I mean, how would we be able to do that without the safety net of her parents close by, if anything were to go terribly wrong? And so I think it was when we made that first flight, I think, and it was actually out to Washington D.C. by ourselves for several years ago for our first ever public policy conference. I mean, there was a lot of fear of what happens, if you're in, we're in familiar territories here in Mount Pleasant. I mean, it's just so if we fall or something goes bad, you know where to call, you know where to get the help. But what happens when you're in the middle of the airport, or you're in the middle of Washington, D.C. or hotels? How is this going to happen? It's just when you do it that one time, you see what it takes to make that happen. That opened up our whole world, that we weren't just relegated to visiting places that we could only drive to. It's just now we can, tackle I want to say the world, but I mean, there's just so many things we can do to be able to go out and do more. So I think that just gave us the reassurance and
the confidence.
Yeah, to say that this can happen and we can do this. And so I think that so then every trip thereafter, I mean, has been just a major accomplishment for us, and that those are always. It's I think that's part of what the disease is. You find ways to celebrate every victory, everything that goes well, because how bad things potentially could go.
Yes, and we appreciate and we recognize every small accomplishment, and any moment that we get together. We really, really value each other, and we know that we're lucky that we have each other, and we understand, and we're silly in the fact that we just like to be together. Dan and I have always joked that when we're together, we're always together. I mean, we just really. So I think those moments that we can best multiple sclerosis, those are huge accomplishments for us.
And then in turn, because we have such a strong support system, we want to be out there to help other people who maybe don't have that kind of support. Just, if we can be there just to help the other person to realize that, you can do this. And just, we've got combined over 40 years of experience with the disease. I mean, just to give people help and tips, and that's why we do the blog. And
likewise, we get that back from the community, because our MS community is pretty awesome and tight together. We're lucky to be part, and unwillingly part of an MS community. None of us wanted to be diagnosed, but since you're in a strong community of really supportive people that share their stories with you and want to hear your stories.
Well, speaking about that community, today we're talking about Progressive MS Day. And for for several people, today's going to be the day when they're diagnosed with progressive MS. What advice or words of wisdom would you share with those people today?
Just give yourself a little bit of time to accept it, to understand, surround yourself with really, your team, get a strong team, whether it's your family and friends or your neurologist, your physical therapist. Get a really good team, give yourself time, and just don't give up on yourself. That just because it's a diagnosis of a more progressive form of multiple sclerosis, it doesn't mean that you can't still sustain a really quality life. I mean, if you're afraid of potentially someday ending up in a wheelchair, get over that fear. I know I don't want to say a wheelchair is a good place to be, but I know that's to me the scariest thing about multiple sclerosis, and that's where I was when I met Dan. And so there are bigger fears than things like that. You need to take care of your health, watch your diet, and make good choices like that, and stay active and get involved in the community. I think that's big for me, is to be involved, whether it's the National MS Society or the MS Foundation. Just get involved, because there's Facebook communities, Twitter. There's so many social media platforms. This podcast right now, John, there are so many ways to learn about multiple sclerosis. I think knowledge is important, and a support system.
And I think just having that faith in yourself. I know that when the day I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, it's the very next day I woke up, and I'm just like, I'm still the same person I was yesterday. Just having this diagnosis doesn't make me a different person. I don't have to instantly change my life. And so I think, you're when you're diagnosed and you're to the point of a progressive form of the disease, I mean, from one day to the next, I mean, there's nothing different about what you are. I mean, there's the same challenges and everything. Obviously, stuff didn't get better, but things didn't get worse overnight just because you have that formal diagnosis. And so it's just like, how do you push forward? And that's where, like Jennifer talked about, building your team and getting people there. I mean, so that the one thing you don't want to do is close yourself off from the rest of the world, because that's very challenging. But I mean, keep yourself connected to other people.
Well, I asked if you had any words of wisdom, and I think you just shared some really important ones. Dan and Jennifer Digmann, we can find your blog at www.danandjenniferdigmann.com. We can find your podcast, A Couple Takes on MS, on the MS&Me radio network. And we can also find your book, Despite MS to Spite MS, at your website. Thank you so much for joining me today for the first annual Progressive MS Day.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, John. And don't forget, #Progressive MS Day.
Well, that's going to wrap up the first annual Progressive MS Day episode of Real Talk MS. Please don't forget that I always enjoy getting your comments, your feedback, and especially your suggestions for other topics you'd like to see us talk about on the podcast. You can reach me at John, that's Jon, at RealTalkMS.com. Well, my name is John Strum. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.